Thank you for that kind introduction. I am delighted to be with you. Good morning. This is a wonderful time to be able to be with you, to be able to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Australian Parliamentary Budget Office and to celebrate your many accomplishments over the past decade. Before I get started on the talk, and in part because I don't have the slides, I also want to make sure that I thank some folks who made it possible for me to be here today and also made sure that I said smart things, I hope, and that I can contribute as much as possible. So first of all, Heather Millard from the Australian PBO for helping me along the way, and for from the Congressional Budget Office, Barry Blom, Christy Hawley, Anthony, and Rebecca Lanning. Also, I want to thank Cherie Nicole from the OECD, and Lisa Von Trapp, formerly of the OECD, and Barry Anderson, who has connections to and great affection for all three institutions, for his advice. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So in the last 15 years or so, the number of OECD countries that have had established independent fiscal institutions, or IFIs, has more than tripled, from 8 in 2007 to more than 30 today. And the total, when you include national, subnational, and regional, currently stands at 41. There is an increasing recognition that IFIs are important and that the work that we do is vital. It is the nature of that work and how we go about it that I want to focus on today. That is, what are IFIs supposed to be in theory, and what do they look like in practice? To try to answer that question, I'll spend some time looking at the historical experience of our hosts today, the Australian Parliamentary Budget Office, as well as that of the Congressional Budget Office. And toward the end of my talk, I'd like to spend a few minutes looking to the future to consider what new challenges and demands our organizations are facing or likely to face in the years ahead, and how we can position ourselves to be able to meet them. So what are IFIs? What do they do, and why are they important? Well, perhaps we should start with the question, what are they? IFIs include parliamentary budget offices and fiscal councils. The European Commission defines IFIs as nonpartisan public bodies other than the central bank, government, or parliament, aimed at promoting sustainable public finances through various functions, including monitoring, compliance with fiscal rules, production or endorsement of macroeconomic forecasts of the budget, and/or advising the government on fiscal policy matters. These institutions are primarily financed by public funds and functionally independent vis-a-vis fiscal authorities. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there are currently IFIs in 30 member countries of the OECD. And although the history of IFIs can be traced to the 1930s, most of them, including the Australian PBO, were founded after the global financial crisis. There's great diversity among the IFIs in their history, structure, function, work products, among other things. Despite their important role, most IFIs are relatively small. They range in size from 1 or 2 employees to CBO's 275 full-time employees. And their average size, excluding CBO, is around 20. Now, I should note that the size often follows the costing function. I'll go into that a bit more in a second. Next slide, please. At its most basic level, the role of IFIs is to provide objective, nonpartisan information on fiscal matters to lawmakers as they seek to allocate resources and craft policy. By doing so, IFIs give lawmakers an independent alternative to the information provided by the executive branch. IFIs also provide analytical services to minority parties that otherwise may not have access to them. Our institutions provide analysis that helps focus public debates on facts and on the sustainability of public finances. In doing so, our work helps elected leaders make informed decisions. Our work helps the public form a view on the policies being debated. Our work helps constituents hold their leaders accountable. By providing that information to the people and the elected leaders that are closest to them, our work strengthens democracy. How do IFIs do this? Well, The most common work products are costings, so that lawmakers are better informed about the budgetary effects of changes in law. Budget and economic forecasts, so that they have a clearer picture of the current fiscal and economic situation, as well as a benchmark to measure how that may be affected by changes in law. Research and analysis relating to the budget and implications of a wide assortment of programs and policy options. But that work is only valuable if IFIs have the trust of all stakeholders and the public. Our organizations, and hence our analyses and estimates, must be objective, nonpartisan, and of very high quality. One way that we ensure that we live up to those standards is by subjecting our work, and in many cases our operations, to external review, whether by getting input from a broad array of outside experts on various papers we're writing, by convening panels of outside experts to help advise on the formulation of our budget and economic projections, or through formal audits of our organizations. Next slide, please. In 2014, the OECD adopted 22 principles firmly grounded in real-world experience that brought together the lessons learned and best practices of IFIs. Those guidelines, which help IFIs be in practice what they were envisioned to be in theory, can be grouped into 9 broad headings. They're meant to help countries design and operate their IFIs in a way that provides or produces good performance and ensures their long-run viability, regardless of their vast differences. I'd like to spend a little time looking at each of those categories and its importance in turn, and then with some help from the OECD's case study, I'll describe how it ties to the experience of the Australian PBO in its first 10 years. Next slide, please. Let's go with the next one after that. Excellent, thank you. Let's start with local ownership. For an IFI to be successful, it must take into account the specific legal and fiscal frameworks and political systems and culture, as well as the specific issues that lawmakers are seeking to address. So the first step in ensuring the IFI's enduring success is to seek broad consensus for and commitments to its design and duties. When we look at the creation of the Australian PBO, we see that Parliament created a committee to examine the structure the PBO would take and the range of services it would provide. That committee included senators and MPs of the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, the Nationals, the Greens, and an independent member of Parliament. It also sought input from the public and a wide array of policymakers. Ultimately, the committee agreed on 23 recommendations, representing a consensus among its members. For an IFI to survive and thrive, it must be nonpartisan and independent, both in appearance and in fact. That is, all parties must feel that an IFI's analyses and costings have been done without regard to political preference or any other type of extraneous consideration. In short, policymakers and the public must believe that IFI serves all parties and its conclusions are not limited or otherwise affected by unrelated factors. A variety of characteristics are necessary to accomplish this goal. The IFI's leaders should be selected on the basis of professional expertise rather than political affiliation, and should in turn have full freedom to hire and dismiss staff on the same basis. The leaders' terms of service should be clearly specified, as should the criteria and the process for their removal. In addition, the IFI should not make policy recommendations. In Australia, that's exactly what we see. The parliamentary budget officer serves a set 4-year term and cannot serve more than 8 years. Although the requisite qualifications are not spelled out in law, the officers have all had extensive experience in public policy and the Australian budget in particular. The criteria for removal are set out in law. The officer is free to appoint staff, which principally comprises technical specialists in economics, public administration, and similar fields. Almost 2/3 of the staff have postgraduate degrees. And by statute, their loyalty rests with the Parliament rather than the government. The Australian PBO has stated it does not have a policy advisory role and does not make policy recommendations. According to the OECD, an IFI's mandate must be clearly defined in legislation and should include the types of reports and analysis it will produce, the parties who may request those products, and the timelines for their completion. In addition, the mandate should establish clear links to the budget process. And finally, IFIs should be free to conduct analysis and write reports at their own initiative, again, within the scope of their mandate. In the case of the Australian PBO, the Parliamentary Service Act spells out its mandate: to inform the Parliament by providing independent and nonpartisan analysis of the budget cycle, fiscal policy, and the financial implications of proposals. The specific functions of the PBO are also spelled out in law, namely to cost policy proposals on request, to respond to requests for information on or analysis of the budget, and to undertake such research on its own initiative, including medium and long-term projections of key budget outcomes, as well as analysis of fiscal sustainability. In 2013, the PBO's mandate was expanded to include a report on the cost of political parties' election commitments to be produced within 30 days of the end of the caretaker period of general election. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, in consultation with the PBO's Oversight Committee, develops an annual work plan that specifies its priorities and planned resource allocations. And the law creating the PBO identifies certain work that it may not do, including producing economic forecasts. In fact, the law specifies the PBO must use the economic forecast contained in the budget. Next slide, please. Resources. This best practice is fairly straightforward. It requires that resources allocated to IFIs must be commensurate with their mandate so they can fulfill their work in a credible way. The Australian PBO has received multi-annual funding in the past, and its funding has been increased along with additional responsibilities. It's not to say that there are enough resources for the future. It's a backward-looking statement. Now on to the relationship with the legislature. Mechanisms should be in place to encourage accountability to the legislature. Those mechanisms could include requiring the IFIs to prepare reports in time to contribute to the legislative debate, requiring IFI leaders to testify before relevant committees, and requiring Parliament to scrutinize the IFI's budget to take part in appointing and dismissing its leaders. We've already seen that Parliament, particularly the Oversight Committee, plays a role in appointing or removing the Parliamentary Budget Officer. In addition, the Parliament also exercises oversight of the PBO through annual scrutiny and approval of its budget work plan. By consulting on the work plan, the legislature can ensure that the PBO will be working in areas that are of interest and consistent with the priorities of the Parliament in the coming year. Finally, the Oversight Committee can request an independent review of the operations of the PBO after each general election. The OECD also recommends spelling out in statute an IFI's priorities in responding to various parliamentary requests or for analysis from the budget committees or their equivalent or other committees, individual members. Although those are not spelled out in statute, the Australian PBO released an information paper in 2018 establishing a framework for prioritizing such requests in response to the recommendation of the 2016-2017 audit. Access to information. To make sure that an IFI has the information required to do its job, the OECD advises that the IFI's right to obtain all relevant information in a timely manner should be guaranteed in legislation, with any restrictions clearly defined. Although the Australian PBO does not have its right to information guaranteed by statute, it has negotiated memoranda of understanding with a number of heads of agencies permitting information access. Independent audits have so far concluded that the MOU system has worked well. The PBO has cooperative, non-adversarial relationship with the government, enabling it to access information it needs in a timely manner. And that is a result that many other IFIs would envy. Next slide, please. Because encouraging transparency in public finances is a key goal of IFIs, they have a clear responsibility to be as transparent as possible. Such transparency only helps ensure their independence. Not only ensures their independence, it also allows them to build credibility with the public. In particular, transparency should include publishing and making available reports and analyses, including methodology and underlying data, as well as testifying before parliamentary committees. And again, we see the Australian PBO makes its work publicly available to the greatest extent possible within the constraints of its mandate. All self-initiated work is available on its website, including the methodology and underlying assumptions and data, its costing and policy proposals requested by parliamentarians during the caretaker period for general election are also publicly available, as is its report on the budgetary effects of parties' election commitments. In recent years, the PBO has expanded its costings to include more detailed discussions of the factors affecting uncertainty in its estimates. At the same time, the need for transparency must be weighed against the parliamentarians' need for information as they develop their policies. Therefore, the law enables the PBO to provide confidential costings to parliamentarians upon their request outside of the caretaker period. Because the IFI's work is persuasive, the OECD advises that they develop effective communication channels with various stakeholders. Media coverage helps foster informed constituencies that may exert timely pressure on governments to behave transparently, and we've seen recently responsibly in in fiscal matters. The Parliamentary Service Act does not spell out the methods or types of external communications that the PBO should use with the media and the public. But the PBO has adopted an approach that is consistent with the intent of Parliament. It emphasizes letting the work speak for itself to the greatest extent possible. And that means that the officer typically publishes formal statements on the PBO website, makes public speeches, gives on-the-record comments before parliamentary committees, and responds publicly to correct the record when the PBO's work has been misrepresented. The officer is also available to respond to media requests. So finally, we're to the last box, external evaluation. The OECD recommends that IFIs have their work evaluated externally by local or international experts. That evaluation can take several forms: a review of selected works, an annual evaluation of the quality of an IFI's analysis, a permanent advisory panel, or a peer review by an IFI in another country. Such independent reviews can help identify areas for improvement or even suggest new analyses to ensure the IFI's relevance and capabilities evolve with the environment. Here we see the National Audit Office completed an independent performance audit of the administration of the PBO in 2014. The audit concluded that at that early stage of the PBO's history, the office was, quote, already well regarded as an authoritative, trusted, and independent source of budgetary and fiscal policy analysis. It also noted, for the first time, all parliamentarians have access to independent policy costings and information request services during all periods of the parliamentary cycle. Moreover, it said that the PBO's work has improved the transparency around election commitments and facilitated a more informed public debate in budgetary matters, about budgetary matters. The PBO's Oversight Committee requested independent reviews throughout the following the general elections in 2013, 16, and 19. The 2016 review made 16 recommendations, and the PBO agreed with all 16. In fact, they took steps to implement all the recommendations that were within their power to do so. The Australian PBO gives us many clear examples of how an IFI can implement in practice the principles the OECD spelled out in 2014. Next slide, please. It may be also instructive to look at the experience of another IFI to see how it has translated theory into practice. And of course, the one I'm most familiar with is the US Congressional Budget Office. Like the Australian PBO, CBO quickly established itself as an authority in budget and economic analysis. Next slide, please. I'd like to quickly review the ways in which it was able to do that, again, using the framework of the OECD's 9 broad headings. Next slide. In the area of local ownership, CBO was established to fulfill unmet needs as determined by the Congress. Those needs revolved around a new budget process, which required information independent of that provided by the executive branch. The Congress continues to express its ownership of CBO by appointing its director every 4 years. Because the US legislature is both bipartisan and bicameral, directors are usually chosen by consensus. A variety of factors help CBO maintain its independence and nonpartisanship. In keeping with the OECD's recommendation, the term of the CBO's director is set in law. The director, in turn, hires staff strictly on the basis of their expertise without regard to political affiliation. The agency has strict rules to prevent employees from having financial conflicts of interest and to limit their political activities. Now in its 5th decade, CBO continues to follow important precedents related to independence and nonpartisanship that were established by its founding director, Alice Rivlin. I'll highlight 2 of particular importance. First, as Director Rivlin made clear from the beginning, because CBO's role is to provide information and analysis to the whole Congress, it would harm the trustworthiness of that information if we appeared to take sides. To avoid that, she made clear that CBO must assiduously refrain from making policy recommendations or characterizing particular policy positions as good or bad, wise or unwise. We provide positive analysis, not normative judgments. Another important early decision Director Rivlin made was to have CBO produce its own economic forecast, a decision that took some in Congress by surprise. But she understood that it would be difficult to maintain CBO's independence from the executive branch if the agency had to depend on that branch's economic forecast. The importance of that decision soon became apparent as the forecasts of the executive branch proved unduly optimistic in the following years. Having our own economic forecast also provided an internal control that supports objective nonpartisan work. Our projections of spending and revenues must be consistent with our economic forecast and vice versa, and our cost estimates must be consistent with our current law projections of spending and revenues. And our reports must be consistent with our cost estimates, projections of spending and revenues, and our economic projections. And for those reasons, no individual analyst or their perspective can go too far afield without being pulled in by the rest of the group, the other views. An added advantage is that all of our work is comparable across all areas and topics of the budget. But I want to focus on one aspect of it, which is each time that we add a dimension to our work that has to be consistent with the other dimensions of our work, it adds to the rigor of the entire body of our work. In terms of our mandate, CBO is established to provide objective, nonpartisan information that would support the budget process. Our mission then is to help the Congress make effective budget and economic policy. Certain reports are required by law. The most widely known is the Budget and Economic Outlook, which is due February 15th of each year. We're also required by law to produce formal cost estimates of every bill, or nearly every bill, that has been approved by committee. The idea being that before the House of Representatives or the Senate vote on a piece of legislation, they have a CBO cost estimate to consider. The law makes clear, though, that those estimates are advisory. They can, but do not have to be used to enforce the budgetary rules. And it's also made clear in the law that it is not CBO that enforces the rules. The budget committees do that. Our mandate has also evolved over time to be more specific about baseline analysis, to require more information about mandates and the long-term projections, among other things. Next slide, please. CBO has benefited from the consistent support of the Congress and received resources that allow it to credibly fulfill its mandates. In 4 of the past 5 years, CBO has received appropriations equal to the amount it requested. And in the one exception, we actually received more than we had requested because the Congress provided funds to cover costs that was discovered after the request was submitted. Next slide. CBO's authorizing statute lays out in detail the agency's relationship with the legislature. As I've already mentioned, it spells out the term of the director, the process for appointing or removing the director, and the budget committee's role in that process. It sets out how CBO should prioritize its work, making it clear that the primary duty and function of CBO is to support the budget committees in their roles, but CBO also provides support to other committees, particularly Appropriations, Ways and Means, and Finance, and the congressional leadership. The director regularly appears before congressional committees to explain CBO's analyses and to answer questions about those findings. Clarity about its role has been an important part of the generally positive relationship that CBO has maintained with the Congress since the agency's conception. Even though at any given time, one party or another may disagree, perhaps strongly disagree, with an estimate that CBO has done. The value of that relationship has been illustrated many times over the years as CBO received strong congressional support, particularly from the budget committees, when it was under fire from detractors. Next slide. CBO's authorization gave the agency access to information from the executive branch. That statutory requirement serves as a valuable backstop. And we have, in addition, roughly 20 memoranda of understanding with agencies for the use of their data. In practice, we find that most effective means for procuring necessary information is to ask nicely and then provide safeguards to assure agencies that the sensitive data that we receive will be protected. Next slide, please. Like the Australian PBO, and in keeping with the OECD's best practices, CBO strives to be as transparent as possible in its work. And our efforts in this area have three main goals: to promote thorough understanding of our analysis through accessible, clear, and detailed communication, to help people gauge how our estimates might change if policies or circumstances differed, and to enhance the credibility of the agency's analysis and processes by showing the underlying data, research, and feedback from outside experts. Transparency has long been a standard part of CBO's work, and it includes posting all reports and cost estimates on our website, testifying before the Congress on a wide variety of topics, and publishing answers to questions that stem from that testimony. We regularly compare our current estimates with our previous estimates, as well as with estimates of outside organizations. We also try to be very clear about the uncertainty in our estimates and how those estimates would change under policy alternatives. In recent years, CBO has undertaken many initiatives to further bolster our efforts in this area. In particular, we've worked to increase the amount of data that we make available. For example, we release the account level details about our budget projections, as well as the data underlying all tables and figures in published reports. We've developed a wide variety of interactive tools and data visualizations that allow users to better understand our findings and to see how changes to underlying parameters may affect budgetary outcomes. We regularly publish reports on the accuracy of our estimates. And we've changed our cost estimates to include more context and data to better explain those estimates. In addition, we've released computer code underlying a variety of models used for particular analyses. But even with those efforts, the needs of the Congress sometimes lead CBO to keep the results of an analysis confidential. In particular, when committees and congressional leaders are considering legislative options to accomplish their goals, but have not yet settled on any specific policy, and therefore have not made any specific proposals public, it's critically important that the information they get from CBO about the likely budgetary effects of various options under consideration remain confidential. Essentially, we need them to be able to ask candid questions and receive clear answers. In those cases, we keep the analysis confidential, but not once their proposal is made public. So once a proposal that we've discussed in private is made public, the analysis becomes more widely available. Director Rivlin established the approach that CBO would take in its written reports in a memo to staff in CBO's first days of operation. Next slide, please. That is still the approach that CBO takes in its writing today. By clearly communicating our findings without jargon, we fulfill our role of informing the public debate, both within the Congress and among a wider audience. Another important decision that Director Rivlin made early in her tenure was to speak directly to the media. It was not a universally popular decision at that time, but she felt it was important for the agency to explain its studies and reports and the conclusion it reached and how it arrived at them. By doing so, CBO could most effectively contribute to an informed debate in the Congress and in the public. Next slide, please. Over time, we've expanded our communications capabilities in a number of ways. We've developed a team of editors, including graphics editors, who help us communicate our findings as clearly as possible. We've also developed a web staff whose members continually update our website to make our products easily accessible. And we've created positions for high-level staff to manage communications with the media, as well as with members of Congress. So now to the final box, external evaluation. CBO benefits from the significant feedback provided by outside experts. Throughout its history, the agency has regularly met with a panel of economic advisors. That panel, which typically has between 20 and 25 members, is composed of widely respected experts in economics, finance, and budget-related fields. Many have positions in academia, but the panel also includes representatives from business world and private sector economics and forecasting firms. The panel members review CBO's preliminary economic projections, sometimes present their own research, and provide critical outside feedback to CBO. And in fact, we're meeting with them tomorrow on Friday. Over the past decade, CBO has convened a panel of health advisors comprising about 20 experts from a variety of backgrounds, areas of expertise, and experience in health policy and the healthcare sector. CBO also meets regularly with a panel of experts in agriculture. In addition, CBO seeks feedback from external reviewers in many of its publications. Next slide, please. I'd like to spend the last part of my talk with you today considering the years ahead. As I think it's clear, in the first 10 years, the PBO has established itself as a nonpartisan independent entity with highly skilled staff, a clear mandate, and a process of evaluation by outside experts, so that it's continually evolving and improving to meet ever-changing demands. And all of that has led to strong demand for its costings and other analysis. To put it into technical terms, the Australian PBO is crushing it. But what challenges are you likely to face in the future? To help examine that question, I thought we might look at how CBO has changed since its first decade. CBO's early commitments to high quality analysis has paid off in a number of ways. For one, the quality of projections coming from the executive branch improved. Another outcome is that Congress has consistently sought additional information from CBO, expanding its mandate. For example, legislation enacted after CBO had been in existence for about 10 years added a new procedure to the congressional budget process and established explicit guidelines for projecting spending and revenues under current law. Next slide, please. So see on the far left, CBO was created in 75, and then in the 1980s, the baseline was more explicitly defined. About 10 years after that, near CBO's 20th anniversary, lawmakers further expanded the scope of CBO's responsibility by requiring the agency's cost estimates to include an assessment of the effects that proposed legislation would have on state, local, and tribal governments, as well as the private sector. And so the agency worked to develop the capacity and expertise required to produce that type of analysis. In fact, that theme of ever-evolving policy challenges requiring greater analytical capacities and expertise from CBO as well as new products to communicate its findings, is a consistent one in CBO's history. Around the time of the agency's 25th anniversary, its long-term trends involving changing demographics and the cost of healthcare were putting more pressure on the US federal budget. The Congress wanted CBO to examine the effects those trends would have on certain entitlement programs, and therefore on spending, deficits, and debt decades into the future. In response, CBO expanded its capacity to provide analysis of those fiscal pressures, which led the agency to develop an annual report containing projections that look forward 30 years and analyze the factors underlying those projections. In the following years, as the Congress increasingly focused on healthcare, CBO continued to hone its analytical expertise in that area. And now we're doing that in the area of climate change. At the same time, we're expanding our ability to assess the effects that proposed changes would have on distant groups based on income or race or gender. Over the past few years, the theme of adjustment and change continued, not only in building or further developing our expertise and capacities in various policy areas, but also in the way CBO operates. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic, the agency produced cost estimates for a number of significant laws enacted in response to it, as well as publications that provided information about rapidly changing economic and budget outlook, all while still providing its regular analyses. The agency did all of that under intense time pressures while operating on a fully remote basis, which meant quickly building up our technological capabilities. Since then, CBO has moved to a hybrid system that includes both remote work and in-office work. But regardless of where we've been working from, we've maintained or expanded the work that we do. So what can the PBO learn from CBO's experience? Perhaps the only certainty is change. New policy areas will move to the forefront. Unexpected domestic and international developments will occur. And the agency will need to show great flexibility in responding and be able to quickly build up its capabilities in whatever ways are necessary to allow it to be effective. The good work that it does in one area will likely spur demand for new or expanded analysis. And because the work is of great importance, the demand for transparency is also likely to increase. So how do we ensure that we'll all be able to meet the challenges we face? Next slide, please. Maintaining excellent staff. At CBO, we've benefited from a virtuous cycle. Having a staff of smart, dedicated, talented people makes other smart, dedicated, talented people want to work at CBO. And it's a significant reason why CBO is routinely ranked as one of the top places to work in the federal government. Being able to maintain such high quality, high skilled workforce is a big reason why CBO has been able to keep doing high quality work. But that high quality work is only recognized as such if it is seen to be objective and nonpartisan. To make sure that it is, we've developed an elaborate process for vetting job candidates, and in certain cases, contractors, to make sure that the people we hire are not only able to do objective analysis, but equally important, be perceived as doing objective analysis. Build institutional capacity. CBO has an unwavering commitment to quality. So it's difficult to do something new to our standards. But as I've said, we have a long history of being asked to do new things. When that happens, our central concern is that we do the new thing as well as we do our other work. We're now in the process of building institutional capacity in the areas of climate change and distributional analysis. And we do that by applying the lessons we learned when developing capacity to do mandate statements, long-term budget estimates, and estimates of health insurance coverage. Because CBO's analysis is evidence-driven, being up to date on the academic literature, and in some cases encouraging more studies in some areas, is also part of building institutional capacity. Speaking of evidence, we need new sources of information and data. And we need to learn how to make our new analyses consistent with our existing products. That way, we receive the same reinforcing benefits of rigor and objectivity from our new products that we receive from having consistent budget and economic projections. Redouble the commitment to clear communications. As technological advances allow us to engage in more sophisticated analyses, it's critical that we remind ourselves of our founding director's admonition to focus on the clarity of our communications and accessibility of our work. In conclusion, I am certain that if the PBO maintains its focus on excellent staff, continues to build its institutional capacity, and clearly communicates its work to stakeholders, it will be well prepared to meet new challenges and excel in all of its endeavors. Last slide.